Well, good afternoon. I'd like to just to welcome everybody to the Iowa Freedom Riders in Is Revenge the Best We Can Do? A conversation with the Iowa Freedom Riders, sponsored by the Johnson County Interfaith Coalition and the Beloved Community Initiative. The way the evening will go is where there'll be a narrative at the beginning and by the Iowa Freedom Riders, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the towards the end. You're more than welcome to ask all your questions by the chat through Q&A. And without further ado, I will turn it over to the Iowa Freedom Riders with Raneem Hamid.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We can start with introductions. My name is Raneem Hamad. I am an organizer with IFR, and I am a current senior at Columbia University studying human rights and specializing in public health. And I'm excited to be speaking with you guys today. I'll pass it off to David.
So my name is Dave Drustrup. I'm a PhD student in counseling psychology at the University of Iowa. Raised in Iowa and been in Iowa City for most of my adult life. I'm a mental health therapist and I've worked most recently with IC Compassion and the Mobile Clinic and the LGBTQ Clinic.
My name's Sophia. I'm also one of the IFR organizers, and I'm a student at the City High School in Iowa City.
So we wanted to start tonight to ground ourselves in this affirmation by Assata Shakur. And so I will start reading that now. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And so we just wanted to make sure that we are grounding everything that we're going to be talking about tonight on these words and the love that they have and the just the meaning that they have, that they hold in and of itself. But David, I'll pass it off to you again.
Great, thanks, Raneem. So as a white male in this work, I feel that it's my role, really the role of all white folks, to support the work and take on some of the labor of the women and femmes of color who are working for the livelihood of the most marginalized people in our community. And so this wonderful quote from Assata is when she's speaking directly to Black people, but I think we can all take something from it. And because my lens and approach is different as a white person in this work, there's another quote that I like to use and I think helps ground other white and other financially secure people in our work in these movements. And that is this one from Stephen Salaita. He says, my loyalty will never accommodate a flag, country, monument, law, luminary, conqueror, tycoon, legislator, myth, party, corporation, military, king, queen, prince, celebrity, or politician. I pledge allegiance to people everywhere in the world who are unloved by power. And so Stephen Salaita, the Palestinian scholar here, talks about power, and power is something that we'll talk a lot about today. So power is many things, for anyone who is white or male, financially secure, employed, over 30, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, without disability, neurotypical, etc. We all have social power in some form or another. And social power largely means that we are free from having to worry about certain things. Our voices are often centered and respected. Maybe we're part of an organization or a neighborhood group or other institutions, and these are the things that protect us. And maintaining the status quo helps those of us with these types of social power. It protects our privilege whether we ask them to do it or not. And not everyone enjoys that social power. So the end of August in Iowa City saw a lot of different things happen. IFR, we were in the streets protesting for a couple weekends in a row. In response to the second weekend, many city officials wrote publicly about their opposition to our use of graffiti. One other night, there was a white man who ran his car through a group of our protesters. A lot of things happened over this 7 to 10 day span. In response to these events, there was a highly respected public official who responded to the graffiti by saying, quote, "This has to be punished." Several other city officials, including the sentiments of some of our city councilors, repeated this. And these Iowa city leaders have equated justice with revenge. And this is the backbone of America's response to social problems, an eye for an eye. And so if someone does something that's broadly considered illegal, the large American culture says that they must suffer consequences. But IFR's response to the man who attempted to hurt us was very different. Raneem made a public statement that y'all can search for online, where she argued against the idea of sending this man to jail. And so we have to ask ourselves, why did she do that? Why didn't she want an eye for an eye, like those people who objected to the graffiti? So we know that prison does not help people be accountable for their harm. It only harms them further. Prison is a toxic culture that is void of support and full of abuse. So instead, IFR asked the question, what was missing in this man's life that led him to want to harm people in such a violent way? And how can we, as a community, call him in to be accountable for what he's done to make sure that it never happens again? And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're here to ask the question, is revenge the best we can do? And this is a question of the culture that we hold in the United States and whether that culture aligns with the morality that we want to embody as a nation. So in our current system, when someone does something that is popularly considered illegal, our common response is that they should be punished for that. The punishment, we usually attempt to make it commensurate with the so-called crime. Angela Davis talks about the idea of retributive justice. She says, that is when we have internalized the idea that when someone commits a harm, we must do to them what they have done to us. If we feel injured, then they must also be injured. This is a vengeful retributive justice that has drastically limited our ability to respond to social harm with humanity and compassion. When harm occurs, right now we don't ask, how can we build a relationship with them so that the harms no longer occur? We only ask, how can we punish them? IFR has been imploring our city councilors and other leaders in our city to stop equating justice with revenge. If the crime is severe enough, our culture supports putting these people in jail and prison. The culture of jails and prisons are essential here because these are humans in cages, much like animals in captivity, behind bars and away from family, away from friends, away from their romantic partners, their children, away from the outside world, from robust education, from adequate mental health care and physical health care. They're away from all the things that keep us safe and help us to thrive and grow. These people are essentially thrown away. The idea that these are correctional facilities is laughable. We have some of the highest recidivism rates in the world because the extreme punishment that exists in our police and prisons does not inspire change. It only leads to more suffering and a depletion of emotional, cognitive, and psychological resources. So when someone commits a social harm, the society or the legal system enact revenge on them. They certainly do not intend to rehabilitate them, otherwise our jail system would look completely different than it does. In fact, it would be an accountability system where the jail and bars do not even exist, since those are not things that inspire change. So since the system is seeking revenge, we have to ask whether revenge is the best we can do. And certainly some people listening today do not necessarily want this new culture that we're talking about, a culture of forgiveness. They like the current culture, and they want a culture that imagines accountability via punitiveness. And that's okay. That's a personal and a moral decision that these people get to make on their own. Asada Shakur, going back to her because she's wonderful, wrote that, quote, nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who were oppressing them. So we are not in the business of winning over people whose morality relies on things like punishment and revenge. We're here to talk with people who imagine a world where revenge and punitiveness are not used to achieve accountability. And if you're one of those people, then we are here tonight to talk with you, to imagine and brainstorm and collaborate on how we can create that world. So we're going to shift a little bit and give some background on what abolition is, as well as the history of the use of state power in policing. So throughout Western history, policing has developed alongside the development of economic interests of powerful people and institutions. So as the economic landscape of the country shifted, so did police. Police have largely been unchanged when it relates to changes to public safety. So many of us here today might be familiar with the fact that a modern police force in the US was birthed when white civilians were tasked with capturing and returning escaped enslaved people, or enslaved people that they viewed as quote unquote defiant. This happened in both the North and the South. British police forces used to suppress social movements, and these police forces were exported to Boston in the early 1800s, and it's sort of the first form that we can see of modern US policing. The primary operation of these was to squash labor movements and to over-police immigrant neighborhoods. At this time, the US saw a huge flood of European immigration, and these immigrants often organized for their labor rights. So this style of policing, the attempt to squash any sort of uprising, especially around labor movements, has been present since its inception. So in Jim Crow, Southern police worked very closely with local KKK and often were one and the same to enforce Jim Crow laws. And northern cities were afraid of the mass migration happening north since they believed that these Black people were inferior in every way. Thus, they used police power and other systems such as redlining to force new Black residents into ghettos. The post-Jim Crow decades saw expanded federal operations. And these federal operations usually targeted movement leaders, people they saw as threats. This was mostly in the 60s and 70s. And what they did was either kill them or throw them in jail on trumped up charges. And the case of Fred Hampton is a very good case where the FBI came in and killed him in his sleep. And similarly, even in Iowa City, a couple months ago, we saw this happen to Mazen, one of the more vocal activists that we had in the early goings. And they charged him with disorderly conduct and moved him to a jail in a different county, simply because he was well-spoken and charismatic, and they thought taking him away would have slowed the movement down. So after that point, we're going back here, the rise of community policing. We're sort of looking around 70s and 80s and 90s here. So community policing, first of all, is a widely misunderstood concept. Unfortunately, it goes hand in hand with the law and order rhetoric from Republicans from the 70s and 80s, and further carried by the Democrats in the 90s. So this meant that police forces largely changed their shape and began to be much more visible in communities than they used to be. So you'd start seeing police cars driving through neighborhoods and patrolling downtown like they do today, right? That wasn't always the case. This is a relatively new phenomenon. So this is when police began enforcing low-level crimes and focused their attention in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, which is what we call now broken windows policing. So before and during Jim Crow, the fact of having a racist police force was not considered very important because of the more outwardly racist nature of the country. So in the following decades around this time, the police realized that they were beginning to have an image problem, especially after the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party, and especially with the Rodney King video. So around this time, police departments began investing massive tax dollars into police legitimization campaigns, where they inject huge amounts of taxpayer money into things like quote unquote community outreach. So they could better control the narrative of their function, they could squash accusations of racism, and they could maintain their power in local neighborhoods. So these branches of police departments essentially act as advertising campaigns to convince citizens that the police are there to help everyone. However, research has proven for decades that departments with these community outreach projects do nothing to alleviate incidents of police violence, and they only increase trust in the police with their white citizens. In fact, research shows that incidents of police violence are significantly higher in municipalities who spend large chunks of money on police legitimization. So community outreach often includes things like asking community members to meet with police or do drive-alongs, or they host community barbecues. And of course, if ending systemic racism was as simple as holding a barbecue, we would have done that a long time ago. But these endeavors are really feel-good window dressings and require no critical thinking about the harmfulness of the systems that exist. Research shows that community interaction with police only reduces police violence when the individual officers are quote unquote considered family with all members of the community. And this is only possible in the smallest of rural towns, and it's unrealistic to imagine that every officer has the time to build these deep and meaningful relationships with every single member of a vast community like Iowa City. And Iowa City has actually spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in the past few years on these police legitimization projects that only seek to boost the social and neighborhood perception of police, including a full-time staff member that we have right now. So while these hundreds of thousands of dollars are being spent, we still have residents sleeping on the streets every night. The police even reached out to IFR before this event, asking if they could talk during it, which strikes me personally as somewhat absurd. ICPD is a group that wields an unfathomable amount of power, where they've controlled their own narrative and their own budget at every turn for decades, with both the social and financial protection of City Council. So when one opposing voice attempts to carve out one tiny space, like this Zoom call where a voice is permitted the time and patience to be heard, they attempt to interrupt that. So of course, the result of community policing, which is really walking through neighborhoods and letting officers use their discretion to decide who to lock up, has led to mass incarceration. The war on drugs is a really large piece of this, and the police are the first line of attack in the war on drugs. So we don't quite have time to get into all of the magnitude of the destruction that the police are bringing via the war on drugs. But for folks who are interested in learning more, there's Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And for folks who like watching stuff instead, the documentary 13th is also a good place to start. Essentially, as a country, we've chosen to police and punish low-level crimes like marijuana possession or driving with a broken taillight, instead of policing the crimes that truly harm people, like most white-collar crimes. So these decisions and the support for our police who enact these policies are part of the systems of racist and classist control. So this list of historical facts is not mentioned simply as interesting anecdotes, but because by drawing this timeline, we can see that there's no point throughout history where we can identify an American police force that is not operating foundationally to control the resistance of Black and Brown people against the conditions that they've been given. This is also why it's relatively unimportant that individual officers have racial biases or not, and this is why training does not work. Because the underlying function of policing is and always has been to maintain the status quo social order, particularly by limiting the expression and freedom of oppressed people. And the truth about policing today is that they really don't do what we think they do. We're taught via movies and TV that police life is exciting and heroic, arresting bad guys and protecting families. But in reality, the vast majority of police work is patrolling and minor traffic stops. Studies in high crime areas of New York City recently showed that at least 93% of police activity is based on non-criminal interaction. In high crime areas, most police officers feel lucky if they get even one felony arrest per year. Research shows that there's no correlation between the amount of police and crime rates. And given the media that we're fed from the time we're kids, there's actually remarkably little crime in our country. But this runs counter to the culture of fear that's so common in our society. Lastly, when harm does occur, police are incredibly ineffective at solving crime, especially when it happens in underserved neighborhoods, because they simply don't invest resources in these areas. Since IFR got going over the summer, we've had a lot of Iowa City residents who've told us stories about how they have never had police come to help them simply because of the address that they gave them when they reported the crime. And even detectives who make up approximately 15% of police forces nationwide spend most of their time taking reports of crimes that they will never solve. In many cases, they'll never even begin investigating these. Of those crimes that are investigated, the majority are never solved. And one especially painful example of this is sexual assault cases, where less than 1% of all sexual assaults see the perpetrator punished. And police inefficacy has been so rampant for so long that many victim survivors choose not to report this at all, since police are usually insensitive and untrained to deal with trauma and only re-traumatize the people who have been harmed.
So this brings us to abolition. And what is abolition? This will only be a brief overview, but we'll try to add some resources in the chat as we go. But understanding this new way of seeing the world is complex and requires imagination and critical studies into social sciences, race, and class. So please have a look at the additional resources we put in the chat and those on our website. So supporters of the status quo have taught us to believe that abolition is some state of lawlessness where there's no system for accountability and safety, but abolition is actually a much more robust and human-focused social movement. Abolition acknowledges that police and jails, which to say punishment, are very ineffective solutions to social problems. Civil rights activists throughout our history have been abolitionists. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and many youth in the Black Panther Party. And Angela Davis is actually one of the greatest abolitionist fighters of today. So while the Black Lives Matter movement has been co-opted by many people now that it's suddenly popular in the United States, including co-opting in our own city council and government, foundational Black Lives Matter ideology is absolutely abolitionist at its core. So abolitionists often ask the question, do we want police or do we want safety and security? Because although we have been taught that police are what brings safety, there is no evidence to support that, and certainly not within the lived experiences of many marginalized groups in America. This new way of thinking requires an expanded view of what creates safety for people and communities. For most of us, that's healthy relationships, it's sufficient income, affordable housing, healthcare, educational opportunities, good transportation, healthy and affordable food, the list goes on. So how can we expect a system to function for everyone when our city funds the police department at 50% more than the next highest department of city government, while leaving long waits at its community mental health centers, while asylum seekers struggle to find the legal help they need, and while poverty and homelessness are daily realities for people in our community? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used similar arguments when he argued against the Vietnam War. The idea that the US spends unfathomable amounts of money under the guise of national security and still has millions of citizens at home who live in deep poverty was a fact that he called a moral abomination. So similarly, how do we justify such a massive police budget when such a large portion of the non-white, non-financially secure population does not feel any safer with police, and in fact, often feels less safe? And that is why we say defund the police. But defunding is only half of the project, maybe less than half of it actually, because acknowledging that the police only exist to maintain their preferred social order and not to actually offer safety and security for our most vulnerable citizens means that we need to create something that does protect our most vulnerable citizens. Kwame Ture talked about how being revolutionary is always about building and creating. So this means that the most important part of abolition is building up things that we know protect our residents. And that includes housing, food security, healthcare, mental health care, transportation, and infrastructure. It means actually funding these things. And so, look at the wealthy areas of our city and its surrounding areas. Abolition already exists here in these neighborhoods. Police don't drive up and down these neighborhoods, and they don't patrol because there's very little so-called crime. And that's because these communities have plenty of healthy food, they have good jobs, good healthcare, etc. So suburban models show us that additional policing isn't really what helps people, and that it's really resources and opportunity.
So usually when we talk about abolition, the first question that is next is, well, what about the bad guys? So transformative justice is one way that we respond to this. So this section really highlights the fact that abolition is always a project of neighbors. I don't know if the word exists, but it's about building neighborliness, right? It's about becoming more neighborly. It's about learning how to rely on each other for safety instead of the state forces. So police rarely live in our neighborhoods, so we have to ask, why do we allow them to police our neighborhoods? But learning to rely on each other is a long-term project, and it requires a long-term cultural shift about loving our neighbors and seeing ourselves in a much more collectivistic environment. So let's look at an example to describe this. Domestic and sexual abuse are almost always committed by someone the person knows, and very often someone that they live with. And because of those features, that means that the police are never going to be able to prevent this and very rarely can do anything about it after the fact, since there are highly complicated factors that involve the victim survivor choosing to stay close to their family despite any abuse potential. So what can this look like instead? If we're true neighbors, then we're interested in each other's lives. We truly know our neighbors. We stop by their house and we see how they're doing. We bring them things when they need. We help out with childcare for an afternoon if they're overwhelmed. If we're doing these things, then we can recognize when something isn't right. If we hear or see fighting that looks like domestic abuse might be occurring, most of us currently will either do nothing or maybe we'll call the police. But if we're true neighbors, then what we would do is call in our other neighbors. We'd get other folks in the community who know and who care. We would walk over together and we'd knock on their door together. We'll ask them to sit down and have dinner with us. We'll ask the suspected abuser what they're feeling and what they might be needing. If they're stressed about money or the child, then we take care of the child the next night so the couple can talk about their concerns in a calmer environment. We let them know that they don't need to worry about how to pay for their child's birthday present because we maybe know a neighbor who has access to a holiday gift drive at their mosque, et cetera, et cetera. These are just examples that we're making up. But at the end of the day, the answer always comes within the community. But for most abolitionists, this is the hardest question because our current society is so far away from it. And most of us will agree that this is a very long-term project, the project to move away from punitiveness and towards resource provision. But the question, quote, what about the dangerous people, is often a very reductive question that has been formed and manipulated by those in power. Rapists and murderers are almost always hurting someone that they know very personally, and these are not things that the police are equipped to stop. Not to mention the massive amount of sexual assaults and murders that happen as a result of interaction with police and jails. We had a case this summer where one of our protesters was sexually assaulted by an officer and others who had guns drawn on them on their way home. These institutions are the primary site of sexual and physical harm for many people. And if this idea feels new or foreign to us, it's likely because our race or our financial situation has protected us from this knowledge. Many abolitionists point out prisons and police aren't the way to stop rapists and abusers, they are the rapists and abusers. So the question about what about the dangerous people needs to be expanded and say dangerous to whom? People often ask this question because they're afraid of the 1 in a million chance of an outsider coming in and breaking into their house and killing them. But what about the thousands of CEOs and politicians and corporate polluters who enact policy that literally shorten people's lives every day, who ensure the working class don't get a fair wage and can't afford healthcare that keeps them safe? But what most abolitionists do agree on is that when harm does occur, the proper response to someone who commits harm is not to contract their community, which is what happens via police and jails, but instead to expand it. So this requires neighborhoods and social circles of people who are not willing to throw anyone away, even those who commit harm. This involves concerted efforts to engage the harmed and the harm doer with the resources and community that are needed to ensure the harm doer doesn't repeat and the harmed person can heal. We could talk about this for a long time because it's very complicated, but I'll ask Reverend Meg to leave a couple of resources in the chat, including some good books for folks who are interested in learning more. One transformative justice piece often includes truth commissions that exist outside the power of government. So for example, the one we've implemented in Iowa City is not a good example because that one gives no power to the commission itself and still acts very much a part of city government. But I'll let Renee talk a little bit more about that.
So yes, just like David said, David, you said the CPRB, right?
Sorry, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Oh, the TRC, okay. Yeah. So yes, so with regards to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, IFR put in a lot of effort and time in an attempt to make the resolution as strong as possible so that TRC could be as independent and able to fulfill the duties that it really needs to do. But we faced a lot of struggle with city council in terms of just using the verbiage that we really wanted to make with regards to systemic racism and making systemic changes. And again, that kind of just conflicts with the whole purpose of the TRC as IFR introduced it earlier this summer. And somewhat again plays into this performative nature of Iowa City, in terms of being a liberal town that, pushes for progressive agenda, yet in terms of actually putting in that work and, building strong, even if they may be institutional committees that are necessary to do such difficult work, it doesn't really, happen in that same manner. But I'll let David go next, or Sophia, sorry.
Okay, so when talking in terms of abolition, a lot of people seem to ask us, why don't we just change the bits and pieces that we don't like? And our answer to that is that we want systemic change. So many of our city officials have begun using the phrase systemic racism. However, the majority of their actions show us that they do not understand what that means. Explaining this takes time, and IFR will soon have information on our website to help further your understanding of what systemic racism really is. And despite all of our best attempts to educate them and provide them with the resources, they seem largely resistant to understanding the idea of what systemic racism actually is. Because their proposals for changes to policing so far are not systemic, they are reformist. They're what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls reformist reforms. A systemic problem requires a systemic solution, which means we must alter the underlying function of the system and policing and incarceration altogether if we want to make change. Just one of the last meetings, Counselor Susan Mims stated that she wanted to see more training as a solution. She's ignoring that training is what got us here today. On the morning of June 3rd, Little Village published a piece including interviews with the ICPD chief and the police union. They promised not to stand by if officers were abusing their power, and they detailed the training that they received. Later that night, they shot a group of peaceful protesters with tear gas, flash grenades when we were standing still with our hands up in the air screaming, "Don't shoot." What we are bringing is systemic change, to change the motion of the whole system, not just to choose bits and pieces, but to change the whole way the system works. What our council is bringing is ideas of reform hidden behind the idea of systemic racism, because it is more appealing to the public. We see deeper than that. Once we erase the idea of reform from everyone's brain, which has been done and has not worked, we can truly start to bring systemic change to Iowa City and to all BIPOC communities.
Yeah, absolutely. What Sophia's saying about bringing about systemic solutions and acknowledging that reformist solutions have already been attempted and have already failed, just like we saw with those newspaper quotes from Little Village, right? Those are the police chief and the police union talking about their training and why it's good enough, talking about what they're ready to do, and we see how that has failed us. So instead of us continuing to talk about that, I thought it'd be helpful to listen to Angela Davis, arguably the greatest living human rights activist, talk about historical consciousness and the difference between reforms and real change.
So I want to focus this morning on the fact that all the institutions that have been implicated into what is now referred to in the mainstream discourse as systemic racism. We're talking about hospitals and healthcare more broadly, which we have especially witnessed during this time of COVID-19. Schools, universities, juvenile justice facilities, jails, prisons. And of course, all of these institutions have been singled out as sites of reform. They have been pointed to as institutions that will only truly serve our needs if they are reformed in thoroughgoing ways. But every single one of these institutions already has a long history of reform. You know, at first I was going to say reform attempts, but it's not as if past reforms have failed. In many cases, the reforms have been entirely successful, but the institutions have remained structurally racist, misogynist, heterosexist, transphobic. They have all remained tied to corporate capitalism, global capitalism. They have all remained xenophobic. So the question this morning is this. If reforms have failed to have a transformative impact on police or jails or prisons, and indeed on all of the other institutions, does it make sense to simply call for more reforms? What I think is needed in order to answer this question is historical consciousness. Historical consciousness is what we tend to lack in this country. There are white people.
So what Dr. Davis is talking about here and what our city officials are missing despite our best attempts to give them this information and educate them, is the historical consciousness, the historical reality that the things that they're proposing are what led us here today. They're the things that have already failed. And notice that Dr. Davis intentionally does not go so far as to say that reforms have failed. She's saying that they're working just as they have been intended to work, which is not to have any material effect on the racist system. So when our city officials ask for another round of reform, ask for more training, they have no intention to actually fix the racist system. They simply want to placate and appease the dissenters, which, as we looked at earlier in the history, has always been the primary task of policing and the state's exercise of power.
So I want to focus.
So a little bit back, bring this back to, Iowa City and what IFR has been doing this summer. We wanted to speak a little bit about our origin story, excuse me. And so the impetus for IFR really came from the events of George Floyd this past summer, and the passion that it ignited within a lot of the organizers in terms of getting on the ground and putting in some actual work in the community. And so after the first rally that was held, there was a rally early in June that was held, which after a couple of organizers, including myself, went to Minneapolis to join the protests and the movement happening there. And that experience was really formative in helping us really just understand the pain and the struggle that was able to be formed into actual change on the streets, in terms of how folks were organizing, folks were protesting and pushing for systemic change. And so when we came back to Iowa City, we just couldn't, sit back and let, the energy that we got from that trip just go to waste. And a lot of us just wanted to, recreate that in our own community. And so just to talk about a little bit about why IFR was able to get started so quickly and so successfully early on. A lot of us have had experience organizing and doing work in the community, even from high school. So myself, along with Ayla, who's also another organizer within IFR, we were both one of the leaders of Students Against Hate and Discrimination, which was a youth-led activist organization that we co-created in high school when we were both seniors at West High in 2016. So just building on that experience and the connections that we had from then on was truly essential in terms of getting IFR to where it is today. And then again, I want to emphasize that we are truly youth-led and that everything that we've been doing has really been based largely off of the efforts of BIPOC youth in our community. So just wanted to emphasize that as well. And so in terms of our demands, we knew early on that we needed to harness the energy that was, happening within our protests and our rallies into something that was actually going to be effective and something that would actually create change in our own community. And so that's why we decided to create a list of demands early on and push for those as we continue to protest during the summer. And some of those are including, we had four different categories of demands. So those include housing, education, policing, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I largely worked on. And then so some of our demands, I put a couple of them up on here on the slide, but they're also included in our phase 1 demand list, which I know Meg just added into the chat, and they're also on our website. So I'll read some of them off right now just for context, but we have the city council must implement a clear and sensible plan for affordable housing. With regards to eviction, that the Sheriff's Department, ICPD, and other city officials may not enforce evictions until a thorough review of the case has been processed by a social worker and an anti-homelessness team. City Council must mandate the dissolution of the current policing system in Iowa City and begin to build a ground-up architecture for community wellness and accountability. And then finally, that the ICPD must publish publicly publish their full budget, excuse me. And so I'll let David and Sophia speak a little bit to the education piece and the community wellness accountability plan as well.
I can go first if you want. So the two biggest ones are up there right now, if you can see the slides, and that's create an alternative school review board process for students being sent to alternative schools where we tend to see a lot of our Black students in Iowa City at, such as Tate and Trek. And then to implement an actively anti-racist curriculum, along with, I'm pretty sure another one of them was along with anti-racist personnel, hiring diverse and anti-racist personnel, because as soon as you start to see representation in the classroom, and we stop depriving white students even and Black students of true history, then that's when we can start from the root and start change. But we can try and change the people that have already gone through the system, that have already been through the racist curriculum, and instead start to grow our own and start to grow children's minds anti-racist, if that makes sense. But that's mostly the school board part.
And for policing demands, like you can see in the phase 1 attachment that Reverend Meg sent, our primary call is to begin shifting to a community wellness and accountability system where we are enacting some of these abolitionist theory that we just talked about, where we know that police do not keep everyone safe in an equal manner, right? They primarily focus their attention on keeping white and financially secure people safe. So we take money away from that system that operates that way and into things that we know keep everyone safe, such as housing and mental health care and transportation and infrastructure, et cetera. So that proposal demands $5 million away from the police department and into these other resources. And we chose that number because that still leaves police as the highest funded piece of city government. And it brings the police budget back down to around 2011 or 2012 levels. So for folks who have been in Iowa City for a long time, they sort of have a point of reference to get behind for that. And then the thing we've been working on recently in the policing section is on how we respond to nonviolent calls, emergency calls. So IFR has been pushing for a change to a system that has peer professionals and mental health professionals respond to these calls instead of police, right? Police are trained in use of force, and they're trained they're not trained in resource provision, things that keep people safe. So we ask for peer professionals, medical professionals like an EMT, and mental health professionals to be the ones who respond to all these calls. Things like homelessness or substance use don't require someone with a badge and a gun. In fact, those things often escalate the situation and make it much worse. Certainly police are very poorly trained to handle mental health calls. They say that they get like 40 hours of training on those types of emergency calls. And that's the amount of training that a mental health professional gets in a single week. And this is something that they do every single day. So it's pretty clear that should be the direction that we're moving in. What City Council has attempted to do recently is applied for a grant that has them, that gives them money to implement a co-responder model, which is when a social worker goes along with a police officer. And the reason that this is something that we're very clearly against is for reasons that get down to what we just talked about, the essential nature of policing. A co-responder model still gives police the discretion and the authority to use force or to enact the law on whoever it is they want. So it's a reformist change. It does not change the underlying function of policing. So our next fight is to push back against that and continue to provide resources to the City Council about why we're pushing against the co-responder model and towards a peer response model instead.
And so in terms of the reactions of city officials and different community-wide organizations with respect to IFR, there was a variety all in all, and specifically in terms of councils, Iowa City Council, I'll speak specifically to our housing plans even. For example, we haven't had a lot of traction in terms of any of our housing demands with Iowa City Council, but in terms of the Coralville City Council, we've been able to gain a little bit more traction there in that sense. It's been interesting going through dynamics between each council because the Coralville Council has really been much more taken an initiative into, coming and speaking with IFR and understanding what our goals were for our communities and what we wanted. But with respect to Iowa City Council, there was, a lot of just struggle into even getting our demands, to council members and being able to talk about these demands with council members. And then again, in terms of organizations within the community, DSA, the Eastern Iowa Bond Project, the Tenants Union, DVIP and RBAP, as well as the Mobile Crisis Center have all been organizations that have been very supportive of IFR. I also really want to shout out the Eastern Iowa Bond Project because they helped out a lot during the summer and during protests, and in terms of bailing people out and helping people with getting arrested and all that, protesters getting arrested specifically. And David, if you wanted to speak to the support of the others, but.
Yeah. I mean, just for political reasons, we don't want to say that they're quote unquote supporters necessarily, but we have had really fruitful conversations, and especially this list of people and many others that are not listed here have been they come to us right with hopefulness and openness. There can be a big difference between different types of orgs. Some come to us with a list of the reasons they don't like us and the things they think we're doing wrong. But like the ones we have listed here have been really interested in collaboration and sort of learning about what it is the folks of IFR are looking to do. So it's been a very much team environment. And the same is true for the Johnson County Interfaith Coalition hosting us tonight, and the Beloved Community Initiative too. I'll just take this time to say thank you to y'all for hosting this and for the way you approached us. Just really open-minded and interested in how you could lend your wisdom and experience to us. And so we're very grateful for that. Thank you.
And so finally, we wanted to talk about this question of does police brutality happen in Iowa City? Because it's a question that we get a lot. Even city officials even asked it before in terms of when we brought up our demands and this whole discussion. And just wanted to emphasize that just because, well, first of all, just in terms of my own personal experience, and at like Iowa City, IFR organizers in the community this past summer, a lot of us have experienced police brutality just in the sense of just protesting. I was, when Matt Bruce was arrested that day, I was, physically attacked by police officers as I was trying to, make sure that he wasn't arrested alone. For example, the nights of the events of June 3rd in and of themselves were just an example of this brutality that, we deem to not happen in our own community just because we think Iowa City is, so progressive and so blue. And then I'll give, Sophia, you can have your own space to speak about that as well, but I just wanted to emphasize that when folks just, make that statement that police brutality isn't something that happens in Iowa City, that they disregard and erase a lot of the experiences, negative experiences with police that BIPOC folks in our own community have, and how detrimental that is to the BIPOC community.
Yeah, so I just want to say that like anywhere there's a system where someone has power over another person, there's going to be an abuse of power. And in Iowa City, we have police and we have the citizens. There's been tons of police brutality in Iowa City, although a lot of people fail to realize it, especially during the protest on June 3rd, which was mentioned earlier. A girl was having a seizure and they kept throwing tear gas. I was walking with Matt Bruce and another guy right before Matt Bruce had got arrested, and 9 officers were running behind us. And it doesn't take 9 officers to arrest one guy. And it's just, even though it may not be someone getting shot every single time, it still happens. And the little things do add up, and every little thing is a microaggression against BIPOC people. So yes, police brutality does happen in Iowa City.
And even to the example in the case of Chris Kelly, who was arrested in front of Hy-Vee, that's just, a very obvious example of how the system just does not operate the way that people intended to, and is truly just systemically, ineffective in every sense of the way, and just poses harm on the most marginalized in our community. And so in terms of how you can support IFR, we just recently published a website that you can go ahead and sign up on there to join our listserv to support us, as well as you can applying to join IFR. We always need more people to help us do this work. It's a lot, and there's only so few of us. So we're welcoming anyone to go on the website and apply, and email us the application. And then most importantly, advocate, and that's the easiest thing you could do, possibly, whether that's during city council meetings, or sending emails or letters to city council members about being supportive, the mental health aspects of our plans, or the just the community wellness plan in general. All that support is very much needed. And Sophia and David, if you guys have anything else to add, feel free to as well.
Nothing for me to add. I just want to say thanks again to Johnson County Interfaith Coalition and the Beloved Community Initiative. And yeah, looking forward to everybody's questions in a second here.
Oh yeah, go. Q&A.
Here we go. All right, the first question is, are there other cities similar to Iowa City that have taken steps to reduce police responsibilities and move in the direction of community wellness model?
So yeah, there definitely are examples. These are big systems that require a lot of challenge, and so it does not happen broadly. More often than not, it happens in neighborhood spaces before it happens in full city spaces. So some examples of that, we kind of have to look to the Bay Area for like really good examples of what this looks like. Oakland, San Francisco, Sacramento are all they're pretty ahead of the curve when it comes to reimagining how we manage safety in communities. So they've set up these systems where you can call a number and someone will come that is not an armed police officer. They're an EMT plus people trained in all kinds of different methods of healing justice. It could be a mental health professional. It could be someone who knows how to like read tarot cards. Like it's all these different kind of de-Westernized ways of understanding healing. But the point is to just have people who are not trained in use of force, but are trained in how to get you the things you need. Like maybe you need a ride to stay with your sister that night in order to be safe, right? The main question for them is, how do we become safe tonight? How do I make sure that you are safe or that you get the things you need? So I'll put some of those links in the chat once I finish this to some of those neighborhood examples, but also there are larger examples for how municipalities are implementing this stuff. Denver, San Francisco have done this recently. New York City has a grant for this type of community response to non-emergency calls, or sorry, non-violent emergency calls. So instead of sending police officers to a mental health call, they send a mental health professional, and they send an EMT, and they send a peer professional, somebody who's been through that before. And those municipalities experience extraordinary success. The Cahoots model in Oregon is one of the big ones that we've been trying to push with city council. And they're a city that's not that different from us. Maybe they have a couple 100,000 people, but they see millions of dollars in savings every year because they send mental health professionals instead of police. So it diverts people from the hospital. It diverts the need to send cops on these calls that they're untrained to do. So I think they see between $5 and $10 million in savings a year, not to mention not putting the violence of police officers on the plate of people who are already experiencing an emergency.
The next question is my question because I can't type it in there. But I did, after our first meeting, I talked to a few of the participants that were on the call. And one of the things that they wanted was models. So if, and you did mention that briefly. So if you could, any models that you have for this policing, that are going towards community policing, could you add any of those to the chat?
Yeah, we can definitely do that. And it's a project that, right, we use that word several times, where the models that we are going to, or that we hope to implement, are piece by piece. Sure. And they're also via feedback from the community. Like an essential piece of abolition is that the people in the community get to decide how they are policed, how they construct their own sense of safety. And so we currently have a model that says police are how you're going to be, quote unquote, given safety. We have no option around that. And so an abolitionist framework says we get to step back and decide. And so like some of the things that IFR is pushing for right now, which is the peer response to nonviolent calls, that's a really important step in that path. Once that happens, we acknowledge that it'll come with mistakes, and we'll need to change things, and we'll need to bring in other stakeholders in the community, and we'll tweak it as we go, and we'll change. And then, so first of all, this is something that abolitionists might disagree on, like the timeline. But some of us might say, okay, at that point, now what do we want to do for police calls that might be for something violent, that might be for folks who are experiencing like domestic violence in the house today, like right now? What do we want to do instead? How do we envision calling someone in to make sure that they're accountable, and stopping that violence that's happening, while also not doing it punitively, right? That's a question that the community has to answer for themselves. So we can put in some answers for what that looks like. But I also hesitate to say like, this is what you do, because the community has to be the one who decides that. It has to center the voices of people who are traditionally not included in that conversation.
Okay. Next question. Do you see a genuine possibility of abolishing abolishing systematic racism locally in the present composition of the elected bodies and administrative leadership, or is it necessary to completely change the people in these positions?
I would say that it's...
Oh, go ahead, Sophia.
Sorry. It's not just something that's going to come as soon as we change the people, because everyone still works together. It's something that's going to happen over time. And it's going to take a few different people and a few different things. It's going to take a while, in my opinion. It's not just going to happen overnight.
And then I think also, the question kind of answers itself in terms of, when you say systemic and then you say elected bodies, it doesn't matter who's in office. If a system in and of itself and how it is structured has inequity present in it, whoever is in that position is still going to function at some source of inequity if that system is not, created in a just manner. And so I feel like it's hard to ask that question, because until these, again, we'll take the policing system as an example, until that system is, completely restructured to where it is based on justice. It doesn't really matter who the police chief is, because they are still functioning in that, racist or white supremacist, based system.
Yeah, totally agree, right? When the systems are fundamentally left unchanged, there's nothing, it doesn't matter who's in charge, which is also why we say that we're not necessarily concerned about the individual intent of a police officer, because they're part of a system that encourages and forces them really to enact a racist set of policies. So that's why we use the phrases like all cops, not just the bad ones, right? But that was a really, I liked that question. That was a very good question, especially as we lead up to what is going to be a big election. We have to ask that bigger question, like, does it matter who's in charge at the top? And that's a very reasonable question to begin wrestling with. Abolitionists have really different views on that. Angela Davis, who we've been invoking a lot today, she says that, you know, she's a big Biden supporter, not because she likes anything that he does or agrees with him at all, but she's a very big supporter of her vote for him, only because he is going to make her work as an organizer easier. But at the end of the day, a lot of other abolitionists will say they simply don't participate in the process, like electoral politics, because they don't recognize it as a legitimate space that's ever going to get anyone free. And all we need is a dose of historical consciousness to acknowledge the truth of that. Electoral politics has never once provided a system that is not racist or not classist. It gives us like a slightly less racist system. Is that what we want? Is that justice? No.
Next question. What is the plan to provide training to healthcare providers about interactions outside of policing? Because we know that even healthcare providers are trained to rely on police as backup, and how to break that mentality.
I'll start with that one, just because I'm a mental health care provider, I'm a therapist. You know, we kind of are trained to, but not really trained to work with police. We're trained that in XYZ situations, we should call the police when we feel like we can't handle or guarantee the safety of someone. So that's a task that we are fighting in our own career, our own system, to say, how can we sort of decolonize the sites of state harm that we participate in? And so a lot of us in my program right now are talking about how we can work with our clients to limit the need to ever involve police. And, you know, from the folks we've talked with who are already doing some of this work in the community, like, they're ready, they're excited to do this work that does not rely on police. You know, for some people, it does maybe feel good to have the police as a backup. And maybe that's a step along the way. That's probably something that abolitionists will disagree with each other on. But at the end of the day, we deal with people who are quote unquote high risk all the time. I mean, I've been doing some type of clinical work for like 6 or 7 years now, and I've never ever once been uncomfortable that someone is going to harm me, or that or that without police they're not going to be okay, right? That's sort of a myth that exists on the outside. We're trained to deal with folks who are in life-threatening situations, and we're comfortable with it. I mean, I can see why other people might have trouble approaching someone who has schizophrenia and is talking about ending their life, right? But for me and people who have had any type of training in mental health, like, that's not a scary thing. We know how to do that. We're comfortable. So the training that would occur is absolutely important. Like, in the 1 in 10,000 chance that something does get out of control, then maybe we do need to add that tool to the mental health care workers toolbox. But that is infinitely safer and more anti-racist than trying to give this whole set of mental health care approaches to the police officer, right? We're trained in two vastly different things. And so if we can just learn how to deal with that 1 in 10,000 chance that something is out of control, that is going to be much, much safer for our community.
Piggyback on that, what is IFR's position, or what are your feelings about mental health court? Where a person doesn't go to, a person that may have a mental disability of some sort does not go through the same penal system as someone who we consider sane. And Minnesota has a model where they have a court and a court process where the mentally challenged people go to, and they get counseling and different therapies. I haven't seen that in Iowa, and I'd just like to know what your feelings are about that.
My opinion is that that's a very good idea, because a lot of the time when we're talking about social justice, we don't take in account people's like mental stability and everything like that. We just assume that they're supposed to handle it like everyone else. So like having a different court for people to go to that caters to them, like could help bring them justice in the way that they deserve justice or the way that they need to be talked to. So I think that's a very good idea.
I think my thing would be in terms of like who is going to be awarded this privilege and who gets, you know, to be tried at a mental health court, because we know that there will be huge disparities in who, you know, actually gets to have, you know, these rights of being tried on a completely different scale, I guess. And Black and brown people are largely not going to be that demographic within that. And so unless that idea would ensure that there wouldn't be disparities in such a project, I would be okay with it. But I'm still, again, just like, I would have to do more research on it personally, because I'm not very well versed in that, to be honest.
Yeah, so totally agree with what you both are saying there, right? To Sophia's point, the spirit of it is good. And if we can enact it in a non-racist and non-classist way, then wonderful. But like Raneem's saying, we're still not changing the underlying function of the justice system, right? It's still reformist in that sense, where we're not taking away the discretion and the ability to abuse power, because we have to go back and ask the question about who are the ones handing down the sentences, who's allowed access to this system, like Raneem said. And until we take power away from those who are making those decisions, they will always be levied out in ways that have an unfair burden against communities of color, LGBTQ people, financially insecure people. Alex Vitale is a sociologist, and he talks about this question in the book, The End of Policing, if folks are interested in more info.
Next question. Are there any current U.S. municipalities that do not have a police department and a jail, prison, and don't have an agreement for policing from a nearby municipality? What kinds of models exist for transitioning from a police model to a community model?
Well, we got the suburbs. I'm being kind of funny with that, but that is a really important thing to look to, right? Because where I grew up as a financially secure white person, I don't remember police cars driving by. Like I can think of 0 times where that happened. And we can go to suburb areas and have that same sort of model, like what was talked about earlier. So I can't remember if Reverend Meg posted this, but the Mariama Kaba article on police abolition, she gives a really robust response. So I won't take up that time. I'll post it in the chat if it hasn't been there already. But we can look to that as a real answer for what this can look like. To answer the other question, no, it doesn't exist anywhere in the West, at least as far as I know, simply because the systems of power and the money that comes from it is too vast, right? There's so much money in the prison industrial complex, it's unfathomable. And so cities want a part of that, right? The power that be, the police unions, the cities that benefit, and all the corporations that are part of the prison industrial complex, they're not going to let go of that power and that money. So yeah, thanks Reverend Meg for posting that. Take a look at what Mariama Kaba says about it in there for a little more info.
Okay. Next question says, I hear you say that reform isn't the way to go. What would you say to folks who are sympathetic with everything you're naming, but who think that reforming slowly over a time is the best way to do this? Maybe there's a fear that rapid systematic change would lead to more chaos or more violence.
So to like first answer this question, I actually want to read this Malcolm X quote that I think answers this perfectly. And it's one of my favorite quotes of his, but it says, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. They haven't pulled the knife out. They won't even admit that it's there. So I think that answers the question really in its fullness. But another thing that I want to add to that is this issue of, you know, the sphere of chaos or fear of more violence. And I think it's really important that we, just as a people, in our own communities and that you know we live in, have more trust in each other. That pushing for progress and pushing for new ways to do things that are actually going to be just for everyone around us isn't going to cause chaos. And trust that we, you know, are all going to, you know, push for the best interests of those around us. I think a lot of the times we're so focused in this like fear-mongering based like perspective that we're so afraid of change, that we're not trusting ourselves and trusting our neighbors and trusting our friends and families that they would be able to do to be better and push them to be better. But yeah, if you guys want to add anything else.
My answer to that question would be to just look at reforms that have happened in the past and where they are now. We really didn't get much progress done and we didn't really make any change. So why would we keep trying to do something that we've done and it hasn't worked? You have to look for a new solution, and that's systemic change.
Yeah, and also chaos for who, right? Violence for who? We're worried about new changes causing violence. Wait, we need to zoom out here, because if we're asking that question about like, what about the violence that could occur? That is assuming that violence is not occurring right now. And we need to be very intentional about who we're listening to and whose stories we're centering, because chaos and violence is a very, very real part of interaction with police for Black and brown people every single day. Yeah.
My next question is, well, first of all, I want to ask, are you all familiar with the 1619 Project? Good. And would you, do you believe that it would be a project that should be implemented into the Iowa City school system, as well as the university?
I think maybe because I'm biased, because a lot of the professors, not a lot, but some of the professors who are on the 1619 Project are from the Columbia Department of African American History. And so I've just been in that community and the discourse around that. But unless we truly, truly understand the effect and impact of the brutality that was slavery, I don't really think that there's any progress that we can really make, you know, as a nation or as any community in the United States. And just, you know, I'm thankful that I myself, like, as someone who went through the ICCSD school district from elementary school all the way to high school, and then had the, you know, thankfully had the opportunity to go to a school that really had these discussions and conversations in classes. I was just so shocked with how much I didn't know about my own race and how much I didn't know about what the discussion about race was in America, being someone who graduated from ICCSD. It was actually very terrifying to come back and also notice that a lot of my friends, you know, who maybe didn't get exposed to the same education that I did, also didn't have these understandings and just basic things that you should know about history. And in my opinion, if you don't really know your history, there's not really a way that you can move forward progressively.
So go ahead, Sophia. I'm sorry.
Oh, you can speak if you want.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, I was just saying that, yeah, like education is the most powerful tool that you can obtain in life. And like I said before, like once we start truly educating Black kids on their history, their future is going to be so much better. And once we start educating white kids on true history instead of whitewashing and lying to them constantly, over time, then we'll start to see change just through that one thing, just through telling the truth, through telling us like what this country is really built off of, what my history is. I'm a junior in high school and I truly don't know what my ancestors went through. They can tell us that they were slaves. They can teach us about how they got the slaves, like the boat ride over. They can teach us all that, but I truly don't know what happened. And I'm still waiting for that. I've been in school for how many years now, and I still don't know my history, and I study history every single year, and I don't know. I've been deprived. The white kids next to me have been deprived, and maybe that's why they treat me differently, because they've been deprived and I've been deprived. So once we truly start educating all kids on history, then that will make change itself.
So wouldn't you say by implementing something like this is maybe a step forward to bringing people to a better understanding as we grow? Because when, as a young person, if you know the truth about about race, if you know the truth about your history, you would appreciate your Black brother or your white brother a little bit better. Would you agree with that?
And I think that just goes back again to IFR's demand from the beginning of the summer in terms of just having an anti-racist curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
That sense of awareness and self-consciousness that a lot of, the reality is a lot of American kids in high school to this day don't have, just because of the way that our education system is set up. And until you have that level of, consciousness kind of somewhat mandated, we're not going to be able to really, truly push for any positive change in our communities. Because again, we're just erasing history and completely trying to, work upon a narrative that is just so misconstrued and whitewashed. And that's just not going to cause any change.
And I love how Sophia goes back to that idea that this hurts white people too. This hurts white kids too, right? And Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, he uses the image of the dream, like the idea of waking white people up from the dream that we exist in. And part of that is being protected is not the right word, being shielded from the real education of where we come from, of where our opportunities come from, of where our resources come from. And I think of course that will, to Pastor's question, of course that will change our understanding of our relationship with other people, and how we interact in our community, especially when it comes to movement building.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that concludes our Q&A session. I hope everybody had opportunity to ask all the questions that you had to the Iowa Freedom Riders. Also, before we close, I want to say thank you to Donna Scarf, who is our sign language interpreter, and the great job that she's done. And to Reverend Meg Wagner in the background, who is orchestrating this whole webinar and makes us look good. Is there any other closing remarks before we go?
Nope, just thankful for the opportunity to be here and to have these conversations.
Yeah, thank you all, everyone, for making this happen. Pastor, Reverend Meg, everybody doing the work behind the scenes, and really great questions tonight too. Thank you. If anybody has more stuff, feel free to shoot us an email and we can engage that way. And check out some of the resources. We chose those very intentionally. And so learning more about abolition and all this type of work in general, it takes time, and we got to listen to folks who have done it and who have been thinking about this for a long time. So thank you all very much.
Okay, well, that wraps it up. We'll thank everybody for all you've done, and keep up the good work, IFR.
Bye, everyone.
All right.
Thanks so much.